So this online talks links in with our current exhibition, Who, What, Where, Stories of the Women Behind Redruth's Rag Trade, which Janet inspired and kindly helped with. So Janet's new and ongoing research looks at this fascinating history and places the groundbreaking company Crusade Silks in Newlyn, founded in Newlyn in 1918 and expanded to St Ives in 1926 into its wider national context. So this talk will also provide an opportunity to learn to value future textile design and manufacture in Cornwall. So Janet Axten is a researcher, writer and lecturer. She moved to St Ives in 1985 and graduated with a first-class honours degree in history from the Open University in 1993. So she obtained an MA in the Cornish Studies with the University of Exeter in 2004. And in 1996, she co-founded the St Ives Archive and was its heritage manager for the next 24 years. So in 2008, she was made a bard of the Gorstaf Carno with the bardic name, I'm not going to try to pronounce that in Cornish, but St Ives in My Heart. And Janet is currently researching and lecturing on the role of women in the textile industry in West Cornwall. She is also part of the recently formed Crusade Collective, a group which brings together curators, specialists and makers from all across Cornwall to celebrate the working process of the Crusade Silk Company in Newlyn, St Ives, Hale. So I'm now really pleased to pass over to Janet and hope everyone enjoys the talk. Thank you so much.
Hello. Are you ready for me now? Thank you. First slide, please. Thank you. Next. No, the one before. Oh, I had an introduction. Never mind. Thank you, Alice. I had an introductory slide, but not to worry. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell the story of textiles in the west of Cornwall, which will be particularly focused on Crusade Silks. I hope that what I'm about to share with you will only be the beginning of a broader interest and awareness in this aspect of the county's story. Clothes is a subject on which we can all have a view, and yet we appear to know little about its history, especially in this part of the country. The interesting research I've been doing over the past 2 years or so is therefore, not surprisingly, covering new ground. At the same time, although the story of Crusade Silks has been in the public domain for at least 30 years, its wider significance is still not properly understood, either locally or nationally. What links the two strands of my talk is how ordinary women were employed and earned an income. It has always been the women who have been the main producers of our clothes. Nevertheless, their lives have usually remained under the radar. Yet by examining the subject in more detail, I believe we can begin to acquire a deeper understanding of West Cornwall's wider social and economic history. Next, please. Until fairly recently, there appears to have been little interest in studying the manufacture of clothes. Traditionally, dressmakers, tailoresses, and milliners, especially in the 19th century, often had to battle with the way they were perceived. A couple of years ago, I visited a local history archive to research its dressmakers and drapers. When I explained why I was there, a man in the room who I'd never met before said, "Oh, dressmakers, weren't they all prostitutes?" I believe that this is only one of the negative assumptions that we are likely to encounter when researching the history of textiles. Women making clothes has not been perceived as doing a proper job. Yes, it is important to understand that thousands and thousands of women worked and still work very long hours in appalling conditions, earning very little money in textile factories around the world, making clothes for us all. Not surprisingly, there have been women, especially in large towns, who have had to resort to prostitution just to make ends meet. But it is sad that making clothes might automatically mean being a prostitute and not doing a vital job. Next, please. Textile production is a very ancient activity. Wool was the original fiber used once man moved on from wearing skins. In the 17th century, farming was the occupation which employed by far the largest proportion of the population. And this was also true in Cornwall, where there were thousands of sheep. It is known that the wool of Cornish sheep had a rough texture and therefore probably not very comfortable to wear. Despite this, we know that material used in Cornish yarn and cloth manufacture usually came from local sources. The Devon and Cornwall long wool, which you see here on the screen, is a recent breed and was created in 1977. It is a merger of two local breeds, the Devon long wool and the South Devon, which is found in South Cornwall. It is a very productive provider of wool and is coarse and hard wearing as well as warm. Next, please. For thousands of years, the same processes have been applied when making garments for wool, from wool. Sorting, washing and drying, dressing, carding or combing, spinning and weaving, followed by a series of washing, drying and fulling processes. Country people were involved in spinning the wool by hand. Small groups of women received consignments of raw wool for carding and spinning at home. If necessary, a card or spinning wheel could be borrowed for 1 penny a week, which would later be deducted from wages. The spun yarn was taken to a local spinning house at prescribed intervals and exchanged for payments and fresh supplies of raw material. Making clothes was very much a family concern. The women and children would spin the wool and the men weave it into cloth. Apparently, unmarried women could earn a good income spinning, hence the origin of the word spinster. Next, please. From early in the 19th century, the domestic wool industry slowly died out in Cornwall, but remained in the Isles of Scilly until around 1900. The eminent photographer, Mr. Gibson, had the foresight to preserve images of this cottage industry, and the wonderful photograph of an elderly woman carding with her spinning wheel behind her is in the collection of Penley House Gallery and Museum in Penzance. Next. Here we see modern carding implements and two methods of spinning. To understand what is involved, early on in my researches, I went to a workshop in Hale led by Nina Ferrer. The middle image shows the carding implements and the wool that we were about to prepare. On the left, Nina is using a drop wool spindle. Women have been using this method for thousands of years. It allows them to walk around indoors and out and spin when they are not working at anything else. On the right, you see the spinning wheel. This has also been in use for many centuries. It is operated with a foot treadle, providing a continuous process. Next. An example of a weaving loom can be seen in the Penryn Town Museum. It belonged to the fascinating Violetta Thurston. Violetta was a nurse, and she managed ambulance units both during World War I and the Spanish Civil War. Born in Sussex, she learnt to weave in Sweden. After she retired and following many adventures around the world, in her 70s, she moved to Flushing and became an early member of the Cornwall Guild of Weavers, Spinners and Dyers. The guild became the Cornwall Crafts Association in 1973. Violetta continued to teach, weave, write and travel, dying at the age of 99. Other items connected with her weaving life in Cornwall are also on display, including her important book, the use of vegetable dyes, originally published in the 1930s. Next, please. After a piece of woolen cloth has been woven, the fibers are loose, airy, and unmeshed, similar in texture and appearance to a piece of cheesecloth or sackcloth. Also, the cloth retains a significant amount of oil or grease, which must be removed if the cloth is to be dyed, since these will inhibit the binding action of the dyes. The next process in the production of finished cloth is therefore fulling or tucking, which for centuries was carried out in fulling or tucking mills. There, the raw cloth was thickened and shrunk by being pounded in a solution of fuller's earth, so that the weave was no longer visible. The mills were driven by water power and were often adjacent to grist mills, which ground corn. After fulling, the cloth was stretched on poles in nearby meadows. The men did the work of fulling, and they were called fullers, and were generally employed by the clothier running the mill. This map shows where some of these mills were located. You can see that they often appear in clusters. Next, please. It is still possible to locate the site of some of the mills. The image on the left is Valensega at St Buryan in the far west of the county. There is nothing to show for the mills now except a small stream, which apparently at one time supported 3. There were several in the Helston area on the River Cobar, and these have been identified and photographed by the local historian William Benbow. The mills in Grampound, which is on the Fal, go back to 1653, when there was uninterrupted access to the sea, and in 1801 the mills became woolen manufacturers. Next. It is very difficult to find illustrations of fulling. It was such an everyday activity, and yet it apparently was not thought necessary to record visually. Here is a rather stylized painting from Scotland, which is the best I can do. In that part of the world, apparently, it was the women who did the fulling. And as you see from the title, they would sing while at work. Next. It would be difficult to find a more charming and intimate painting than this, a mother patiently teaching her young daughter how to knit. For generations, women taught their daughters to knit and sew and mend their own clothes. The knitting lesson was painted in 1906 when Dame Laura Knight was living in Stace, Yorkshire. The residents of Stace led very austere lives, not dissimilar to the families living in Newlyn at that time, where Laura and her artist husband Harold moved to in 1904. Next, please. Women in the seaports around Cornwall were renowned for their knitting. All the fishermen wore guernseys, each port having its own individual design. If a fisherman was lost at sea, his home port could be identified through the garment's unique pattern. You may have seen the informative book Cornish Guernseys and Knit Frocks by Mary Knight, originally published in 1979 and reprinted in 2008. It also provides 30 knitting patterns. Next. Now, what were working women wearing in Cornwall in the mid to late 19th century? The majority of the population in Cornwall worked on the land, the sea, or down the mines. Whatever the activity, most women needed to add to a family's limited and often irregular income. According to the detailed research on bal maidens that Lynn Mayers has undertaken in her important book, Bal Maidens, Women and Girls of the Cornwall and Devon Mines, the women and girls going to work in summer would wear a light calf-length dress covered with their best apron, plus a gouk or bonnet, and what was usually their only pair of shoes. In winter, they would wear a heavier, warmer dress covered with a shawl, a felt bonnet and boots if they had any. However, working with oars was a messy business. The bal maidens all look very clean in this photograph as they are posing in their walking out aprons without their protective leg, arm or hand coverings. It is likely that their day-to-day working clothes would be long past first or even second best and were probably hand-me-downs. Their aprons might be made of Hessian bags. The girls themselves would likely do their own mending. For those working out of doors, the head covering was a crucial part of a girl's protective clothing. Heads and necks needed protection from cold, wind, and wet in the winter, and sunburn in summer. In addition, they also needed protection from excessive noise levels and from flying splinters. They were in several different styles. The Museum of Cornish Life in Helston has this beautiful example in its collection. We've not been able to discover who made these bonnets. The work is very intricate and would have required the skills of an expert milliner. Next. Fishing families around the area, including St Ives and Newlyn, were very poor as regular catches couldn't be relied upon. Men, women and children worked together in the cellars to process and pack the fish. It is likely some of the women had only one dress, which would have been regularly altered and repaired. They all wore hats, which look as if they too have been repaired many times over. The women probably owned several aprons, and these kept their dresses clean. Next. Farming was a major industry in Cornwall, and yet there appears to be comparatively little written on the subject. Again, whole families helped with the work, men and women sharing many of the jobs. I'm finding it very difficult to discover a selection of good photographs to include. Next, please. These women harvesting mangolds look as though they're wearing Hessian sacking as aprons. It would have been very tough and muddy work. Notice their woolen shawls, which they would have knitted themselves. Two of the women are wearing bonnets, rather like the bal maidens, while the other two wear old hats, like the women in the St Ives fish cellars. Next. Helston was a prosperous town with a substantial middle-class population. The Book of Helston states that the clothes that people wore were all made locally. Each year, there was an opportunity to dress up and participate in the annual Flora Day. Women apparently had a new dress each time, so there must have been a good supply of experienced local dressmakers. Next. Here we see a group of middle-class women wearing matching severe ankle-length tailored suits and straw hats, almost like a uniform. The famous march from Land's End took place just prior to World War I. Incidentally, it was not very successful because residents of the towns through which they passed thought the women were suffragettes and gave them a difficult time. Next. All working women were able to repair and make simple garments. Repairing especially was a regular and necessary task. This lovely photograph shows a grandmother not even bothering to take the trousers off her grandson before getting to work with her needle and thread. Next. How do we know how many women made a living from dressmaking prior to the First World War? It is by consulting trade directories, the earliest of which was produced in Cornwall in 1783. The famous Kelly's directories began to appear in 1873. They're all available in the library at Crescent-Kerno. Trades were listed in alphabetical order, and often, as you see on the screen, dressmakers and milliners were included under one heading. They were all. It was necessary to pay for an entry in the directory. However, I haven't been able to discover what the charges were. It is likely that there were dressmakers who probably couldn't afford to be included. Some businesses took out advertisements, as the Mrs. Nucky in Penzance did in 1883. I think it's interesting to compare the number of dressmakers in each West Cornwall town every time a directory was printed. For example, in the 1893 directory, there were 54 dressmakers listed in Penzance, 16 in Truro, 7 in Penryn, and 4 in St Ives. Thank you. Next. For rich and poor alike, sewing changed dramatically with the arrival of the sewing machine. The first commercially and technically successful model was patented in 1851 in the United States by Isaac Singer. It was a labor-saving device, and it represented modernity. Professional dressmakers would be able to own these expensive machines by making regular monthly payments. In the more rural areas of Cornwall, women might go from house to house carrying their machines under their arms, where they would make clothes for a whole family, staying for a week while they did so. But sewing machines also heralded the start of women being employed in large numbers by tailors and drapers in towns rather than remaining self-employed. There they would be trained, work regular hours, and receive a wage. There is plenty of research yet to be done about the working conditions they encountered. Next. The Falmouth Textiles and Dress Collection Archives at Penryn has a large collection of popular monthly journals. This one, Leach's Family Dressmaker, marketed at middle-class women, is dated December 1889. The free patterns inserted into each issue were of completely plain paper, with no holes or lines to guide the maker, nor were there any instructions provided. It seems quite clear that women who made their own clothes were very proficient dressmakers. Next. I've already said that many mothers taught their daughters to knit and sew. At the same time, girls learnt to sew at school, some becoming very skilled. From the early 1880s, the government passed a law which stipulated that all children had to attend their local board school until the age of 14. The head teachers were obliged to keep a regular diary of what occurred. These diaries, held at Crescent Kerno, and which make interesting reading, often mention the dressmaking classes. The pages shown here are from other school documents stored at the Redruth Archives. By the age of 12, you will see the girls are ready to start the second class in dressmaking when they will have to make shirts. And a school teacher's needlework scheme at a school in Tregony in 1922 indicates that knitting too was an important skill to be mastered alongside stitching and needlework. Next. All women teachers at the board school had to be able to teach a wide range of subjects, including needlework and dressmaking. I wondered where they'd received their training. I discovered that the Truro Diocesan Training College, originally established as early as 1811, became a specialist women's training establishment. It was Mary G. who made it one of the best training colleges around, with students coming from a wide area. Born in Boston, Lincolnshire, before moving to Truro, she had been principal at the Bishop Otter Training College in Chichester. Thanks to a little-known book written in 1938, Training in Truro, 1813 to 1838 by M. Graham Brown, we learn of the school's expansion. We also get fascinating first-hand insights from the girls themselves, in particular talking about the uniforms they had to wear. Mary G. inspired generations of young women who went on to teach, both in Cornwall and around the world. Now, the next few images show dress shops and drapers in various towns in West Cornwall. These should give a flavour of what might be found on a typical high street. Some I have chosen were owned and run by women. But before we start, there's two things to remember. In Victorian times, middle and upper class ladies were not allowed to earn any money. Their place was strictly in the home. Nevertheless, they were all taught to embroider, and many could sew. As a result of this situation, the women who became professional dressmakers came from lower middle class and working class backgrounds, yet they earned their money by making clothes for an often discerning middle and upper class clientele. It was therefore not unusual for ambitious businesswomen to insert the French word madame in front of their surnames. Next. I've discovered that in the latter part of the 19th century, Penzance had more dressmakers and milliners than any other town in West Cornwall. This was most likely because of the steady influx of new middle-class residents from other parts of the country who were looking for a better climate and working conditions than were to be found in the north of England. These new residents, therefore, demanded a regular supply of fashionable clothes. Madame Legge, here we are, here's our first Madame, was born Fanny Stevens in 1860. Her mother was a shopkeeper and her father a master mariner. By the time she was 20, Fanny was already listed in the census returns as being a dressmaker. In 1888, she married a schoolmaster, William Legge, and 3 years after her marriage, she set up her own business in the building next to the Egyptian House in Chapel Street. The couple and their 4 children lived above the shop, and Fanny retired in 1929. Next. There was a significant professional and leisure class living in Truro, many having made money from mining. After following the latest parish fashions in women's magazines, it was often the custom to purchase clothes direct from London, while others had them made locally in the London style. There would be regular advertisements in the local newspapers announcing the arrival of new stock. N. Gill & Sons was one of the finest drapers' shops in Truro and one of the largest employers. Founded in 1833, it remained in business for 120 years. We are fortunate that Susan Coney, whose grandfather and mother were employed by the company at various times, has written a complete history of the company with copious illustrations. It was displayed last year at the Royal Cornwall Museum. She pointed out that the Gills girls were very well paid and were considered to be the creme de la creme of shop assistants in Cornwall, and they were always in the height of fashion. Next. Katie and her husband John Gribble and their staff are standing outside their shop in Higher 4 Street, Redruth. Note the handcart in the foreground for deliveries. Katie was born Catherine Cocking in 1868 in Redruth and was the daughter of a miner. She originally trained as a draper's assistant and her sisters were tailoresses. John Gribble already owned a draper's shop and the couple went on to manage it together. When John died in 1909, Katie ran the business on her own and a new key branch was opened. After her death in 1940, Katie's grandson John took over. It became known as Gribbles Limited. Local Redruth women still recall buying their wedding dresses from Gribbles rather than travelling to Truro or Plymouth. You can learn much more about Gribbles at the fascinating exhibition currently on show at Crescent Kerno, Who, What, Where? Stories of the women behind Redruth's rag trade. Next. For its comparatively small size, St Just had a good selection of drapers, perhaps because of its relatively isolation and with no direct rail line. Its residents had to rely on regular bus travel to Penzance, 7 miles away. Henry Thomas first appears in the trade directory in 3 daughters, and they all came into the business. Jane and Bessie were still running the shop in the 1930s. It was said you couldn't find a better drapery and millinery establishment in the provinces than the famous London House, or a better loved or more highly respected proprietor than Henry Thomas and his little daughters. Next. Camborne was a wealthy town in the centre of the mining industry, and there were a large number of places to buy clothes. This photograph of Miss Lobb's draper's shop in Trelawarren Street was taken about 1905. At the top right is the shop sign, G. Lobb, General Draper. She specialized in ladies and children's costumes, and apparently the hats being offered for sale are all at the one price of 1 shilling and a halfpenny. Of the 3 women standing in the doorway, Grace Lobb is in the middle. Born in St Columb in 1852, she opened her shop sometime in the 1880s. Zinnie Harvey is on the left. She was a milliner, while her sister Emily, who was a draper's assistant, is the young woman on the right. Next, please. As previously noted, because of Flora Day, clothes played a uniquely important part of residents' lives in Helston. Here we see Edith Wynne, a local milliner who ran a successful business selling a wide range of women's clothes. She is standing in the shop doorway at 4 Maneague Street with her 2 assistants, Miss Jenkin and Miss Pascoe, probably sometime in the early 1930s. Edith Wynne was born in Helston in 1887, one of 6 children. Her father was the borough surveyor and a member of the Helston Old Cornwall Society. We know that Edith's shop was open in 1923 and it was still being listed in Kelly's Trade Directory in 1939. And I'm very grateful to the women of the Helston Old Cornwall Society for their interest and assistance. Next. I should point out that there were no factories manufacturing textiles in West Cornwall until 1918. However, in Newquay, which is slightly out of our area, there was an amazing entrepreneur, Ada Hawke, who had moved to the town in 1885. When her husband, a tailor, died 20 years later, she needed an income to support herself and her 6 children. From initially owning 1 knitting machine on which she made beautiful wool jackets, she was soon encouraged by Debenhams to start supplying that company with woolen clothes. Before long, Madam Hawke, as she called herself, and the name of the business, was employing 450 people in several factories around the town, 80% of whom were young girls, a number coming from other parts of the county. By 1968, the company sadly had finally wound down, but the business is still remembered, as you can see from the rather fine stained glass monograph on the door of one of the original shops. Following this general background, we now turn specifically to Crusade Silks, a unique company which changed the face of quality textile manufacture in West Cornwall in the 20th century. Next. Crusade Silks was originally founded in the village of Newlyn in 1918. It was the brainchild of Yorkshire silk manufacturer and artist Alec Walker and Kay Earle, his Kent-born artist and designer wife. Alec Walker was a keen follower of the arts and crafts movement and already had a shop selling his silk clothes in Bond Street, London. At the time of their marriage, the couple started a small business employing experienced young local girls making expensive silk dresses to a very high standard. These were designed by Kay using plain and patterned English silk. The embryo business was soon taken up by a new, wealthy, post-war female clientele, both within and outside Cornwall. It quickly expanded from being based in the couple's home to a factory premises nearby. Next. By 1923, Alec Walker was determined to improve his painting techniques, and he traveled to Paris, where he met the fashion designer and artist Raoul Dufy. Dufy encouraged Alec Walker to translate his direct watercolor studies depicting images of the Cornish countryside into textile designs and in a variety of colorways. An example, Zena Woods, is shown here. Alec Walker discovered that he had a real talent for this process. Next. The influence of Dufy is particularly apparent in the bright colours and holiday feeling of this small selection of Alec Walker's designs, which matched the mood of the 1920s. The 5 designs shown, starting from top left and going in a clockwise direction, are Dancing Flower, Cornish Farm, Pastoral, Welsh Hill Farm, and in the centre, Newlyn Harbour. Next. From an early date and not wishing to use wholesalers, Walker opened a series of local shops selling direct to the public. Those garments that weren't supplied or ordered through the company's shops were sold through mail order. The first shop was in Newlyn. Then, as early as 1921, premises were acquired in the High Street, St Ives, adjacent to Lanham's Gallery, the picture framers, art suppliers, and wine merchant. When a new branch opened in Tregenna Place. Also in 1921, a branch opened in Market Jew Street, Penzance. 6 years later, however, larger premises were found at Queen's Square. It was on 2 floors. The first floor consisted of 2 rooms divided by a linen curtain. Here, customers could try the dresses on in luxurious surroundings. The blue and white mosaic Crusade logo in the doorway of what is now a curry house is the last physical reminder of the company in the country. A branch was also opened in Falmouth in 1923 at 23 Church Street, next door to the Polytechnic Hall. Next. Returning to Newlyn from Paris with his new designs, proving to be very successful, Alec Walker became ambitious for his burgeoning company. He asked a fellow Yorkshireman, Tom Heron, a blouse manufacturer that he had previously worked with, he asked him to move south and become its new managing director. With no space to expand in Newlyn, Tom Heron looked further afield and was soon introduced to the perfect factory premises in St Ives. A very substantial fish cellar, originally built in 1845 and occupying an acre of land, was lying empty. However, by the mid-1920s, that industry had all but died out, and there was a high level of local unemployment. With the transfer of Crusade Silks to this site, while combining Tom Heron's socialist-leaning management skills with Alec Walker's unique designs, St Ives was immediately transformed into a town with an international appeal, employing a large, well-trained staff, many of them young women, producing high-quality garments. Next. There'd been no history of fine dressmaking in St Ives. Most of the original Crusade staff from the Newlyn Penzance area were therefore bussed daily across the peninsula. Each morning they arrived in St Ives, initially in a charabanc looking like this. These highly experienced workers trained the new local recruits, many as young as 14, in various aspects of the business. Clearly, from this advertisement, the company decided to earn extra income from the company vehicle by organizing daily tours of the area while the charabanc was not in company use. Next. To employ a school leaver in the textile industry, it was necessary to complete a trade board form for a certificate as learner. The Board of Trade Acts of 1909 and 1918 stipulated that companies must comply with certain regulations to ensure that young trainees would not be working in shop conditions and were paid a proper wage, initially 5 shillings a week. Butler, living in Back Road East, St Ives. Next. The printing of Alec Walker's designs onto the dyed silk was undertaken using wood blocks. Here, Keith Ross is demonstrating how a printing block was carved, watched over by Tom Heron, the managing director. The wood used was either cherry or apple or sycamore. The block, which had finger holes on the underside, was of a maximum size of 15 inches by 12 inches. Each color used in the proposed design had a separate block, and each block could take up to 3 days to carve. It was a highly skilled job. Next. Here we see the blocks being printed onto a 30-foot length of dyed silk at long, heavily constructed tables using a wooden mallet. Transferring Alec Walker's complex designs onto the bolts of silk was another very skillful operation. The young men had to work through the entire bolt, quickly printing in one color before starting again with the next. Behind each man was a young male assistant ready to apply the dye onto the block and ready for the next print. Next. Here we see the cutting room at the factory. It was the only department where you would find men and women working side by side. The most experienced dressmakers were employed in this department, and they were responsible for special orders. The bolts of the printed material are lying on the long tables in the foreground. Next. This photograph shows women sitting at their sewing machines, making dresses in the spacious factory. The girls were not allowed to talk while they sewed, but they were allowed to sing. On first joining the company, a novice would learn to sew on buttons, make buttonholes, and be able to hem neatly. Experienced girls had the opportunity to become machinists and make complete garments. Next. I'm not sure who actually designed the clothes. In the early days, it was Kay Walker, Alec Walker's wife. But after the birth of the first of her 2 daughters in 1921, she no longer worked full-time. And when the business expanded in St Ives, other designers must have been employed, but they have not been named. However, we do know one designer, George Criscuolo. He was brought to St Ives from London in 1926 and designed the most expensive dresses, including the special orders. Next. In the later 1920s, the number of Crusade shops expanded in the south of England. The Cambridge shop at 41 Green Street opened in 1928. Its importance lies in the fact that it was designed inside and out by the architect Wells Coates, who was born in 1895, died in 1958. Walker wanted someone to design standardized shop fittings, which could be produced in the St Ives factory. They were made from plywood. Cambridge was Coates' first and only commission for Crusade. The fascia included a stylized, thin-lettered Crusade logo, which lit up from behind at night. Notice how few clothes are on display in the window. The whole look is very different from many dress shops in the 1920s, which could often appear gloomy and cluttered. Sadly, major professional differences between Alec Walker and Tom Heron soon came to the surface because of conflicting approaches to the company's future expansion. As a result, Tom Heron was sacked in 1929, while Alec Walker himself was dismissed a few years later. Heron moved to Welwyn Garden City and set up a company called Crusade Silks. Following the October 1929 stock market crash, Crusade continued to operate with a new board of directors. It expanded its numbers of shops as well as widening its clothing range. But not surprisingly, without the entrepreneurial skills of both Walker and Heron, and in a period of financial uncertainty, Crusade went into liquidation in 1939, just prior to the start of World War II. Next. Tom Heron's new business, Crusade Silks in Welwyn Garden City, operated under very similar conditions to those he had created in St Ives. Meanwhile, the new management at Crusade had always hoped Heron would return to St Ives and revive the company. However, because of the war, it was not until 1947 that a factory was opened in Hale, in the old Cornubia biscuit factory in Foundry Square. There, Alec Walker's designs were printed onto silk using the original wood blocks which had been stored in St Ives. This time, different colorways were created. The resulting garments were made up at Welwyn Garden City and sold through Cresta shops around the country, and the remaining Crusade shops in St Ives, Penzance, and Falmouth. By the early 1950s, silkscreen printing had overtaken woodblock printing. This was a much cheaper and a faster process. Tom Heron retired in 1954, by which time the factory in Hale had closed, and the business was eventually taken over by Debenhams. By that date, most of the original Alec Walker blocks had tragically been destroyed, as no one realized their importance. However, a few Crusade woodblocks from the 1930s are still in existence and are stored at the Royal Cornwall Museum. Next. Despite the closure of Crusade, over the next few decades, a series of textile companies moved into the area because of the ready supply of experienced dressmakers. As years passed, running costs were kept down through a series of mergers and takeovers by outside interests. Originally, there was the London company Flauns, which was bought by John Lewis in 1945. Then Burketex of Plymouth moved in, as well as the Fryer Group from London. The jobs Fryers offered, however, involved mostly repetitive piecework. Production line working, as you see here, now became the norm, while the products themselves tended to be utilitarian: nylon clothing, overalls, uniforms, even tents. Sadly, the industry went into a downward spiral, especially after the oil crises of the mid-1970s. The last of these factories, which had recently been relocated on an industrial estate outside St Ives, finally closed. St Ives was now heavily promoted as a tourist resort. Next. In fact, St Ives was only mirroring the situation occurring across Cornwall. Light industry, including textiles, had been lured to the county by successive governments in the 1940s and 1950s. Following the end of the Second World War, it was decided to benefit areas suffering from high unemployment. These companies were apparently attracted by a combination of regional aid, the availability of low-skilled, flexible, non-militant labor, and environmental charms. Then these businesses too became uneconomical, partly because of the distance from their up-country headquarters and poor road links. Finally, in the late 1970s, government aid was withdrawn altogether. Heathcote's, which you see here, based at Poole and with its headquarters in Tiverton, Devon, was the largest textile factory in the area, which had benefited from this scheme. It had even had its own sports hall. But like all the other textile factories, it closed with the loss of hundreds of women's jobs. Here you see a photograph from the air of the enormous factory building. The current textile exhibition at Crescent Kernow in Redruth features this important company and is encouraging staff who worked there to write down their memories. Partly because of the rise in international containerization from the 1970s onwards, which enabled transportation costs to be vastly reduced, textile jobs moved to countries previously difficult to reach, such as China, India, Bangladesh, and Thailand. This resulted in thousands and thousands of women being unemployed across the Western world. One of the results of this shift was that the next generation of young women no longer automatically learned the art of dressmaking or repairing, nor did they see their mothers making and mending their clothes. The subject was quietly dropped from the school curriculum. Fast fashion became the latest buzzword, and most people now would have little understanding of the way inexpensive, mass-produced clothes are produced. Next. The fascinating story of Crusade Silks has been in the public domain for more than 30 years, thanks to Hazel Berriman. Hazel was curator at the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro in the early 1980s. She began to take a close interest in the history of the company after meeting Alec Walker's younger daughter, Polly Walker. Hazel organized a major exhibition at the museum in May 1993 entitled Crusade, the unique textile designs of Alec Walker. The beautifully illustrated publication of the same name is a fascinating and detailed chronicle of the business with many illustrations. It is the perfect starting point and constant reference for all researchers into the company, but it has long been out of print. Tragically, Hazel Berriman died only 5 years after its publication. Next. Despite its relatively short life, a proportion of Crusade clothes have survived in both public and private collections. In particular, the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro, Penley House Gallery and Museum in Penzance, and the St Ives Museum have acquired clothes, design samples, archival papers, and photographs. Next, please. Penley House has a particularly important collection, and there are always several on public display. They have recently had 3D images created of several of the dresses, and these can be seen on the museum's website. Next. When we look at the clothing industry throughout history, we've become aware that women's work seems to be camouflaged. Finding a good and secure job between leaving school and getting married was what was important to young girls, and therefore if you talk to them, it is quite obvious that they never considered what they did was of any significance. In fact, this phrase camouflaged was coined by a group of volunteers at the St Ives Archive in 2014. It was then that a unique camouflage net of memories was created. The specially made fisherman's net contained extracts from about 50 interviews printed onto calico and woven into the net in such a way that they are hidden among strips of dyed sheeting. These interviews have revealed the stories of women who had talked about their working lives and the working lives of their mothers and aunts in the St Ives textile industry between the late 1920s and early 1980s. Some background as to why it was called a camouflage net. The weaving process I have just mentioned was traditionally known as scrimming. During the Second World War, scrimming was undertaken by women assembling thousands of camouflage nets used for covering tanks and guns. Interestingly, this war work was done in St Ives, in the building which had been the Crusade factory for 14 years. Next. With the net of memories as inspiration, alongside Hazel Berriman's original research, a group has come together under the banner Crusade Collective to study Crusade silks from a wide perspective, hoping to access and catalogue little-seen archival resources and acquiring more first-hand memories. We hope to investigate wider aspects of the business with the assistance of heritage organisations, researchers, artists, and social community groups. At the same time, it is hoped to promote the vibrant textile community we have in Cornwall today, with artisans who work in fashion and textiles in various forms, and promote the Crusade story to wider audiences. During this year, there will be 2 exhibitions featuring Crusade, the first at the Hale Heritage Centre starting in March, and the second at the Royal Cornwall Museum beginning in June. If you would like to be kept up to date with progress and news, and perhaps become involved in the collective, Please send your details to the email address here on the screen. 2026 will be the centenary of Crusade transferring its factory in St Ives. It's now the St Nicholas Court Apartments, and this would be a special occasion to celebrate this extraordinary business and the work of all the women. Next. Many thanks to those who've helped me put this story together so far. As you can see, there's still very much more to discover. And thank you again, Alice and Amanda at Crescent Kerno, for making this presentation possible.